If you've been following my channel for a while, you will know that my dream camera that I've been talking about is Sony making an A7CR, and it looks like it's finally happening. While we're still technically just going off of rumors, it makes complete sense for Sony to be releasing an R variant of the A7C. I did make a video earlier this year about what I would like to see from the A7CR if it were to happen, but now that the Sony A6700 has been announced, I feel like there's a couple things we can take away from that camera that we can expect to see in the future A7C II and the A7CR. So we're going to talk about a couple things that I think this camera needs to have for it to reach its full potential. I would like to think maybe the right person saw my previous videos, so Sony, if you're watching, take notes. Although it's probably too late now if the camera is releasing this fall. If Sony really is making an R variant that is focused on the photography side rather than it being necessarily a hybrid camera that focuses on photo and video, there's a couple things in regards to the form factor that Sony really needs to work on to make people really want to buy this camera. In my opinion, the first and most important thing is definitely the viewfinder. While personally I've gotten used to the smaller viewfinder of the A7C, if you really want to make a camera that's going to target an audience that wants to use this camera for taking photos, you're going to have to do something to improve this viewfinder. It's kind of a tricky situation since I don't really know how much larger Sony could make the viewfinder while still managing to keep the small form factor of this camera, but they can definitely give the viewfinder a resolution boost and hopefully increase the magnification size just a little bit. And while personally I have not used the new A6700, it does seem like they made some improvements. I think it might have a slightly higher resolution viewfinder, but it also has an Eyecup, which the A7C does not have. Having a detachable Eyecup for the A7C II is insanely important because if you've ever tried using this camera out in broad daylight or at certain angles during sunset, it is impossible to see out of this viewfinder. So I think if anything, we will see a small resolution boost and an Eyecup for this. Hopefully the viewfinder will be a little bit bigger. I'm not going to take my chances though, it will probably be about the same size. But regardless, the viewfinder is going to get some improvements, which I am happy about. Moving on from the viewfinder, the other thing I think Sony really needs to work on, which they've also seemed to have done with the A6700, is the grip. When you look at the A6700, at first glance, you might think it's just an A7C because it does have a similar viewfinder. It does have the same general shape as the A7C does compared to the previous A6000 models. But the one big key difference that separates it from the A7C is probably the grip. The grip is a little bit deeper. It does have a scroll wheel on the front. Finally, thank you Sony, I'm glad that is happening, and I think it's a pretty good sign that it's going to happen for the A7C II and the A7CR. As shown with that camera, you can increase the grip and make it just a little bit bigger, give you somewhere to rest your pinky, while still managing to keep that compact size. So those are the two improvements that are almost completely guaranteed to be on the A7CR and the A7C II. But there's a couple other things that Sony really needs to do if they are marketing this camera toward the more experienced photographers. The first being dual card slots. And while personally I've never had an SD card fail on me, and I've never really been worried about an SD card failing on me, one of the most common comments I receive on my videos about the A7C II is the fact that it does not have dual card slots. A lot of people are scared to buy the original A7C because it only has one card slot, and while Sony may have to increase the size just a little bit, looking at the A7C, I think Sony could include dual card slots without increasing the overall size too much. The second thing being that Sony needs to include on this camera, in my opinion, some people may disagree with me, but it seems Sony has ditched it on the A6700, is the dial on the back. On the A6700, it looks like Sony has removed that dial and in its place put a switch between shooting in photo and video mode. Something like that may be helpful on the A7C II, which will be marketed more so as a hybrid camera, and it's a feature which is nice to have on the A7 IV, the A7R5, but I don't really think it has a place on the A7CR. The one positive side of this is they have replaced the exposure compensation dial with a just general dial, which is like what you will find on the A7 IV and the A7R5. But at that point, we're not really gaining anything. On the A7 IV, it is nice having that dial because now you can control your ISO with that dial, which means you have a dial for your shutter speed, ISO, and your aperture. Now maybe Sony does not see this as a big deal since most of their newer lenses do have aperture rings on them, but I do find it to still be a very important feature to have. So let me know what you guys think. Do you see the loss of that dial as a big deal? Or is it not a big deal, especially since we're probably going to be gaining a dial on the front? So I hope it is something that Sony really considers including on the A7CR. And the final improvement that this camera really needs to have is a fully mechanical shutter. The current A7C does not have a fully mechanical shutter, which gives you a couple problems, especially if you plan on using any kind of camera flash, along with the A7C having this weird issue with bokeh when you're using the electronic shutter, where there's just less bokeh or it looks worse. It's kind of hard to explain, but you can look up some videos or articles online about it. It's kind of weird. But the main reason this camera needs a fully mechanical shutter is because the A7C can only shoot at 1/4000th of a second shutter speed. Especially for a photography focused camera, releasing a camera that can only shoot up to 1/4000th shutter speed is a huge mistake. We need at least 1/8000th of a second. Now the only times I feel like you really need 1/8000th of a second is if you're shooting wide open, maybe portraits or something, and it's really bright outside, which I personally don't do very often. But there's no excuse for Sony not to have a fully mechanical shutter. And with that, that's everything I can think of that Sony really should make improvements on the A7CR compared to the original A7C. There's a couple other things that are almost guaranteed at this point that we can expect to see improvements on, such as the new menu system and the AI autofocus. And one thing I haven't seen anyone mention yet is hopefully we're going to get another silver A7C. I think the full black cameras look so boring, and I love the A7C because of the silver model. So please Sony, please give us a silver A7CR. I almost completely forgot to mention that the rumors are also saying that the A7CR will include the 61 megapixel sensor that the A7R5 has, which I am very happy about. I would be happy if it included the old sensor from the A7R3, which is about 42 or 43 megapixels, but I don't really think that would make very much sense, especially if the A7C2 does include the same 33 megapixel sensor that the A7 IV has. Going from 33 to 42 would not really be that big of a jump, which I think also justifies upgrading from the original A7C to the A7CR, because I think the jump from the original A7C to the A7C2, going from 24 to 33 megapixels, especially if you're just taking photos, I don't really see that as being worth it if you don't care about all the other upgrades coming from it. So jumping from 24 megapixels to 61 megapixels, almost tripling the resolution, is a pretty big deal, and I'm very excited for that. And with that, thanks for watching the video, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to help support me so I can continue growing and reaching a larger audience. Leave a comment down below what you think, what you would like to see from this camera, and go out and shoot.